Okay, what's Ricardian equivalence? Well, Ricardo was a famous economist that had a lot of good and interesting ideas, and what he said, well, you know, if a tax decrease causes taxpayers to increase savings in anticipation of higher future taxes, right? So the government is spending the same. They reduce taxes to give people more money to spend, but they go, well, you're just going to have to collect these taxes later, so I'm going to what? Decrease my marginal propensity to consume out of disposable income. I'm going to increase my savings and decrease my spending because I know I'm going to need that money to pay you later on. Now, if the increase in savings or decrease in consumption just offsets the tax decrease, it's termed Ricardian equivalence. Well, in this case, the tax decrease is not going to stimulate the economy because of that tax decrease, they're going to save it all. That's what happens when we have Ricardian equivalence. So they just offset each other, and now this fiscal policy tool of taxes would be impotent. It wouldn't have any effect. Now, we're not saying that this just offsets, but there's certainly an effect we have to consider if we have rational economic agents in the economy. They go, well, just because you cut my taxes this year doesn't mean I don't have to pay for all that government spending. I'm just going to have to pay for it later. But in the extreme case of perfect Ricardian equivalence, increasing spending, issuing debt will have no impact on aggregate demand. Okay, government debt. We talk about a debt ratio. Been in the news quite a bit. What percentage of GDP is government debt? If it's getting high, around 160%, it's probably not sustainable. That country's probably in trouble. If we're down in the 70 to 80%, that's probably sustainable. Well, there's no difference than looking at your own finances, right? How much of your annual salary do you carry in debt? Especially if you take your house out of the equation. Okay. How much debt can you service? You get too much, you're headed for bankruptcy. Keep it in check, you'll probably be all right. So if the real interest rate on government debt is less than the real rate of growth, the debt ratio will decrease over time. What does this mean? Well, if the economy is growing at 5%, then tax revenues are also growing at 5%. So, if the government debt interest rate is less than the real rate of growth, then the income from taxes is growing faster or at a higher percentage than what we have to pay on our debt, so you could actually decrease debt over time. Now, if that interest rate on the debt is higher than the growth rate of the economy, then unless something happens, that debt ratio is going to grow over time. Okay, so should we be concerned about these budget deficits? Some say, yes, we need to be concerned. Others say no. I guess we're not going to deal with right and wrong here, but we're going to list some of the reasons. So here's the reasons to be concerned. Higher future taxes will decrease GDP growth. If we have to, at some point, debt ratio's growing, we got to do something about it, we got to raise taxes, well, that's going to be contractionary, that's going to decrease future GDP growth. Now, another thing, a lot of government borrowing, right? Government's going out and borrowing money, issuing securities. This can drive up interest rates, right? More demand for loanable funds increases the rate on loanable funds. And so these higher rates, businesses are looking at interest rates, deciding how much and to what extent they want to expand, take on new businesses, pursue new opportunities. At higher rates, they're going to do less of that and make less investment. That's the I in our C plus I plus G. This is called crowding out. The government borrowing is raising interest rates, and that's crowding out private investment. which is not thought to be a good thing for the economy, and decreases the investment part. So when we talk about government borrowing to spend, if they're raising that G in C plus I plus G, this crowding out says, well, there's an offsetting effect that's decreasing I, investment by businesses, as government borrowing drives up interest rates. Now, at some point, debt can become risky. We've seen it before in many countries, and many worry that we're headed for it in some of the developed economies as well. So at some point, interest rates rise because of the risk. Country may default or expand the money supply if they can, if they're not part of a currency union, which precludes that. Then they can expand the money supply, cause inflation, and that basically decreases the real value of the debt, but causes all sorts of other problems as well. Now, there are some arguments that deficits shouldn't be concerning, often given by politicians who are spending like crazy. But if the deficit is used to finance capital investment, future GDP will be higher. Well, to the extent that the deficit spending is financing capital investment that's really going to have a future return, it's certainly not as concerning as spending it on consumption. Well, you can look at the same thing in your own lives. Okay? If you're borrowing money to invest in a commercial piece of property that has a rate of return, well, that's not really all that concerning. But if you're investing in, borrowing money and taking on more debt just for your own consumption to fly around the world and drink good champagne or whatever kind of consumption you're into, then that's a whole different thing. Now, there is an argument that deficits don't matter if Ricardian equivalence holds. You run a deficit, people just save more, and it doesn't matter, they anticipate the future taxes. Well, that may or may not be true, but either way, it's on our list of 3 arguments of why deficits shouldn't be concerning. Now, the third one says if the economy is operating below capacity, right, if we're below long-run aggregate supply, potential GDP, full employment GDP, then government borrowing is not displacing capital investment. So, what can we conclude from that? Well, we can conclude that crowding out is not as much of an issue when we're operating below capacity. And I think that when economies are below potential GDP, below full employment, there's certainly more comfort, less concerns with running a deficit. If you're running a deficit when you're at full employment and increasing spending, then that's much more concerning. So we certainly haven't solved the question over whether deficits are concerning or not concerning. Certainly at low levels, they're less concerning than they are at high levels. And if Ricardian equivalence holds, they're less, less concerning. And if the deficits are used to finance investment spending in infrastructure that's going to yield future economic benefits, it's less concerning. Okay, now the Keynesians say, go ahead and shift aggregate demand. Let's smooth out these economic cycles. Well, in theory, it sounds real great. How is it in practice? Well, in practice, there's many problems with it. There's political problems, and there's lags. The first is the recognition lag, and you need to learn these 3 terms. Okay, let me underline them for you. The recognition lag, the action lag, and the impact lag. So say the government decides that the economy is headed into recession and they need to change fiscal policy toward an expansionary policy, increase spending, cut taxes, or both. Well, the time it takes to recognize that the economy is actually headed into recession, that's the recognition lag, that time period. Now, once they recognize that, well, with fiscal policy changes, mostly, legislation has to be enacted to change tax rates or to approve greater spending. Now, sometimes this has been done rapidly. With tax legislation, it really seems to drag on and on. It's a very touchy subject. This is the action lag. And then even after the bill is passed and signed into law, there's an impact lag. How long for this policy change to have its intended effect? Whether it's through taxes, translating to different spending by consumers, or whether this is a government spending. Well, how fast, if they decide to build this military base for $200 billion, how long does it take to build it? Well, that money is spent over time, and remember, the multiplier takes time as well. So the full impact of this policy change may not be felt for an extended period of time. Well, what does that tell us in terms of using these tools, fiscal policy, to fine-tune the economy and dampen out those economic cycles? Well, it can really mess things up. They can do it to stabilize, but maybe by the time the full impact of this government spending reaches the economy, we've already turned the corner and are back in expansion. Well, now rather than a stabilizing influence, it becomes a destabilizing influence. So that's a real problem with using fiscal policy to smooth out these economic cycles. So what are some of the limitations? Well, if we're at full employment, we know that in the short run, an increase in aggregate demand through increasing, say, government spending can increase real GDP above its full employment level, but that's a temporary disequilibrium situation. We said as goods price, input prices, and wages rose, that shifts back short-run aggregate supply. We get back onto long-run aggregate supply or full employment, GDP, and the net effect has just been to increase prices. So remember, in the short run, if we begin at full employment, in the short run, a spending increase, I better write this out, spending increase leads to an increase in real GDP and an increase in prices. But in the long run, it's all prices. Now, if we were below full employment, say due to supply shortages, then even when we're below full employment, this is going to lead to inflation rather than growing GDP if we've got supply shortages. So, if we're at full employment, short run, sure, we're going to get a little bounce in time for the election, but in the long run, it's just going to translate into higher price levels and greater rates of inflation. If the economy is below full employment, then this fiscal spending can help get us back to full employment, unless we're below full employment because of supply shortages, and then it's all going to turn into inflation as well. And our third point here, clean up my other scrawl there, the economy has high unemployment and high inflation. Well, we said in stagflation, yeah, you don't know what to do. Fiscal policy can't address both. Because to rein in inflation, you want contractionary policy. The stag part, the stagnation of the economy at below full employment, that seems to suggest expansionary fiscal policy. So with stagflation, they can only aggravate inflation or aggravate the stagnation of the economy. Tough choice. Okay, how are we going to tell whether fiscal policy is expansionary or contractionary? Remember when we talked about monetary policy, we had that neutral rate. Okay? And we used that neutral rate versus the policy rate to tell if monetary policy was expansionary or contractionary. Well, now, with fiscal policy, we can't just look at the deficit. because we're going to run higher deficits when the economy's in recession, and hopefully lower deficits or budget surpluses when the economy's reaching a peak, when it's in an expansionary phase above that trend line. So whether a particular fiscal policy is expansionary or contractionary depends on where we are in the business cycle. So what we calculate is an adjusted or full employment deficit amount. And that can take out the business cycle stage. Okay? We see where we are in the business cycle versus full employment, and then we project out the full employment budget deficit, and then we can use that to tell if we are having expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy. Okay. Now, overall, if they're increasing spending and decreasing taxes, that's expansionary, at least compared to what it was, and they've clearly entered into an expansionary mode of policy. Spending decreases and tax increases are contractionary. Just understand this one point, that at different phases of the economic cycle, see, even if we had a zero budget deficit over an economic cycle, we'd have a deficit when we were in the recessionary part of the cycle, and we'd have a surplus when we were in the expansionary part of the cycle. So by looking at this adjusted full employment deficit projected over the economic cycle, then we can know overall if we're following an expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy. Policy interaction. This slide and this learning outcome statement seems complex, but it's not that bad. Let's take a closer look at what's going on. Okay, first off, let's look when they're both in the same direction. Okay. So monetary policy is expansionary, fiscal policy is expansionary. Well, think about monetary policy as changing the private sector, and fiscal policy having an effect on the public sector. So, if we have expansionary monetary and expansionary fiscal policy, go figure. Strong expansionary effect. I would hope so. Both public and private sectors grow. Easy enough. How about if they're both contractionary? Decreased GDP growth. Higher interest rates. Well, remember that it's monetary policy that's running interest rates. Okay. So contractionary monetary policy, higher interest rates. Now, what if they're in opposite directions? Well, then you don't really know that much. I mean, if monetary policy is expansionary, then that's going to affect interest rates. We know that for sure. That's going to tend to increase consumption, okay, output. And the private sector will expand. Now, we've got contractionary fiscal policy here, so the public sector is contracting, the private sector is expanding because of expansionary monetary policy, so the proportion of the economy in the private sector is growing relative to the public sector. That's about all we can say. Well, what if we have the opposite? What if monetary policy is contractionary and fiscal policy is expansionary? What's the interaction? Well, interest rates are going to rise. So interest rates are always run by our monetary policy decisions here. So contractionary monetary policy increases interest rates. Okay. Aggregate demand is likely higher from the fiscal. Right? The monetary policy doesn't transmit through the economy quite as fast as just an increase in government spending can hit the economy. So the public sector is growing now, and the private sector may be shrinking. So if you focus monetary policy on interest rates, fiscal policy on the growth or shrinking of the public sector relative to the private sector, you can pretty much walk through this policy interaction without too much trouble. Okay, last thing for you, got a little bit of a problem. See if you've been listening. The balanced budget multiplier is positive because the tax multiplier effect is stronger than the government purchases multiplier effect. The government purchases multiplier effect is stronger than the tax multiplier effect, or the negative effect of government purchases multiplier is less than the positive effect of the tax multiplier. Well, a lot of words in there. You should be able to recognize that the one we're going to like most is this B here. That's why we said the balanced budget multiplier is positive. Now, the tax multiplier is negative, right? When we increase taxes, decreases aggregate demand, but smaller than the purchases multiplier, which is positive. And we saw that in the example where we did $100 billion worth of spending that turned into, what, $227 billion increase in economic activity, because the government purchases multiplier in our example turned out to be 2.27, and then we had the tax effects, which were, I forget, 182, 185, something like that. So the difference in that was our balanced budget multiplier. The reason we believe that's positive is that this spending multiplier on the plus side was greater than the effect of the tax increase in reducing economic activity because of that smaller multiplier.